Welcome to the blog. My name is Craig Winn, your host. I'm going to speak today about something that really very few people seem to understand. And I have a long history with this subject, including being the only person who accurately predicted that the Syrian government would fall and when it would fall. I'm on record both in writing and on radio saying that Islamic terrorists would overthrow the Bashar al-Assad regime beginning 10 years ago. I doubled down again 5 years ago. I wrote about this for a third time and did a series of radio shows on it as recently as 1 year ago. And then about 2 weeks before it occurred, when there was silence throughout Syria, I spoke of it again. And I did a series of programs specifically announcing when, where, why the Assyrian regime would fall. And that's just the most recent episodes on a long story, a long history of what I've come to know about this part of the world. And the reason I want to share it with you is because I was not only able to predict what was going to occur in Syria, unlike any of the talking heads on any of the mainstream media outlets, I know specifically what this terrorist group is going to do now that they're in control of Syria. I understand who funded them and provided their weapons. I know what the implications are going to be for the United States as well as for Israel. But I also understand what occurred in the greater context, not only of America's intervention in the Islamic world, but also the whole history of Islam and how this pertains to what has occurred in the last 1400 years. Now, I earn some credentials in this regard, and that I have composed the most complete, the most interconnected, the most chronological, the most contextual and accurate presentation of the religion of Islam ever written. The 5 volumes exist under the title Goddamn Religion. Each volume is over 800 pages, and in them, I systematically rearrange every surah in the Quran so that they appear chronologically as opposed to the jumbled mess they are currently arranged in. And then I use the 2 historical hadith accounts to place every surah in the context of Muhammad's life so that the religion he conceived is understood. It is impossible to argue with the conclusions that are drawn from this in-depth analysis of the oldest Islamic sources. Because if those sources are accurate, so are my assessments. And if those sources are inaccurate, the religion has no reason to exist. So we'll talk about the history of Islam and what it represents and what it's going to manifest in Syria now that fundamentalist Salafi Muslims are in charge, as well as how we got to this place. And then I will share how I was able to predict what occurred just this past 2 weeks ago. First, when America invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq, at the time I had a reasonable relationship with George W. Bush. I knew people in his administration. I knew him personally. Not to say I liked him, not to say I respected him, because I didn't. But I knew what he had told me before he was elected president, that he was looking to be a wartime president, that he wanted a reason to put America on a war footing because he knew that it is what makes presidents popular. And I knew that on the morning of 9/11, he would use this as the excuse to send Americans off to war. And I knew it would be a disaster. In the years immediately after 9/11, 2001, I did 5,000 talk radio interviews on every meaningful syndicated radio program in the United States, many in Britain, Australia, and around the world. And my message was singular, that America's invasion of Afghanistan and then later Iraq would prove disastrous, that it was guaranteed to make a bad situation worse, and that there was no chance for a positive outcome. At the time, no one was making those claims. And I turned out to be right when no one else was. Now that should matter to you, because the reason I was right is because on the morning of September 11th, 2001, I knew that there was something going on here that was the opposite of what we were being told. That those Muslims who flew planes into America's buildings had not hijacked their religion. They had not misinterpreted their religion. They were living their religion as good Muslims. Immediately after 9/11, I had the opportunity to go directly to the Israeli Knesset. I was sponsored by the Mossad, and the purpose of my trip was to meet with members of Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad. And they arranged those meetings. Now, the reason that this is exceedingly important is that I think I'm the only American to have interviewed Al-Qaeda at the height of its power and prominence and survived the ordeal. I was taken to an underground bunker with specific instructions provided by the Israeli Mossad, such that I could ask them why they flew planes into our buildings and why they thought that was a good idea. The book that chronicles that event is called Tea with Terrorists. It was published immediately after 9/11 and immediately after my meeting with Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad. It was an interesting meeting, to say the least, because 3 of the terrorists that I met with, members of the Islamic Jihad, came in the meeting wearing uniforms that were made in America. They were carrying American weapons. They bragged and said, "You know what happened? Happened last night." It was now 23 years ago, as we look back on it now. And I said, "Yeah, I saw the news." I said, "That was us." What are they speaking about? Islamic terrorists had blown off the axles of a civilian bus carrying Israeli women and children. And when the bus ground to a halt, wearing fake Israeli IDF uniforms, they escorted the women and children off the bus. And then they blew their heads off at point blank range. And they bragged about it. This was my introduction to Islamic terrorism. And when I met with members of Al-Qaeda, what they told me was that they were terrorists because that's what the Quran orders them to be. And they quoted both from the Quran and the Hadith to justify what they were doing, what they would do, and what they have done. Now, I was in a position that Every journalist, every politician, every academician in the world should have been it. But I was there alone. Which is to say, based upon those answers, one of two things is true. They were either cherry picking the worst and most vicious of the Islamic citations out of a virtual mountain of noble and quality loving, peaceful quotes, and making it seem inappropriately that the Quran and Islam were a death cult, or they were right, that Muhammad was a terrorist, that Islam is a death cult, and that they will continue to wage war on all humankind until only Islam exists. One of those two things is true. When I came back, I began that systematic analysis of the Quran. I translated all of its surahs. I set them all in context of Muhammad's life. I used the oldest chronological and quasi-historical sources, the oldest scriptural sources that exist in Islam that allege to be the words and deeds of Muhammad, the Sirah and the Taqrīq. And by using them, I was able to reassemble the entire Quran in the context of Muhammad's life. And when one does so, what you find is that Muhammad was a ruthless terrorist. He was a mass murderer. He was a pedophile, and he was a rapist. He was among the worst men who ever lived. One thing he was not is a prophet. Another thing he was not is a messenger of God. Now, I know these things for fact. I'm not coming up with my interpretation of Islam. This is not a slander of Islam. It is just Islam. I have no other agenda other than I wanted to know the truth, and I found it. I'm going to hold up one of 5 volumes that are dedicated to this very thing. This is the first of those 5. As I've said, they're all over 800 pages. This is over 4,000 pages of analysis of the oldest Islamic scriptural sources. As I've said, there is no way to argue with it, because if those sources are accurate, then everything that I'm telling you is true and it's irrefutable. If those sources are not accurate, including the Tariq, a history of Islam's formation by Tabari, the Sirah, which is the biography of Allah's messenger, which is the earliest chronological and hadith source in Islam, and the Quran, where the messages of those sources are identical. They don't vary at all. And they were both brought to us exactly the same way, by people passing on messages based on their memory, lips to ears, for generations before any of this was written down. But the evidence, the blood-stained sands of Arabia, validate what those scriptural sources say. And what they present is that Muhammad was a complete failure in his role of messenger of Allah. As a matter of fact, as he began in what was Petra, not Mecca, he failed so miserably that the only followers he had in the entire community of Petra were less than 20. And this is after 12 years of making these claims. And all the Quran has to show for it is what I call the never-ending argument. Muhammad saying that because you have said bad things about me, my God's going to get you. You just wait. He is going to roast your britches in hell. In fact, The never-ending argument's the single most prevalent theme in the Quran, where everybody that knew Muhammad, everyone that knew Muhammad, knew that he was demon-possessed. They knew that he was murderous. They knew that he was lying and making all of this up. And they held him accountable for it. And so the Quran responds by saying, no, he's the really truthful sayer, and everybody else is the ones that are lying. It's my guy is right, and everybody else is wrong. And so, as proof of this, I'm going to torture them all in hell. I'm going to rip off their skins. I'm going to make them drink boiling water. I'm going to torture them forever. And just when the torture gets to the point that they cannot stand it anymore, I'm going to give them a new skin so I can torture them all some more. Allah spends all of his time in hell. Who do you think he might really be? He only speaks of being sadistic. And when he is not addressing these sadistic tortures that he intends, then he's promising murderers, terrorists, rapists, slavers, that they will be rewarded for the most immoral and abusive behavior the world has ever known by being given multiple virgins in paradise. These idiots believe it. But that's the Quran. The Quran is very clear. It says every good Muslim is a terrorist. Then it tells good terrorist Muslims to kill all the peaceful Muslims. It even says that the most wretched person of all, the people that are going to endure the hottest and deepest part of hell, are those hypocrite Muslims who don't fight jihad. Now, this is the truth. I will do a series of shows as part of the Yahweh blog that specifically detail Islam's beginning, how this religion came to be, what the oldest sources say. And some of the story that I'm going to tell you will seem stunning. And yet, I prove every word of it. Now, the reason I share this with you is that Islam completely failed in its birthplace. By the time that Muhammad was run out of town, with everyone laughing him out of town, following the satanic verses and the night's journey, he would then find 20 pagans. These pagans lived in Yathrib, and he convinced them to agree to the Pledge of Aqaba. The Pledge of Aqaba denotes the beginning of the Islamic era. It's 12 years into the formation of Islam, and yet it is year one of the Islamic era, because the Pledge of Aqaba defines Islam. It is the birth of Islam. So what is the Pledge of Aqaba? Muslims commit to wage war against all humankind. Islam is a death cult. Now, as soon as that agreement was sworn, these first Muslims went back to Yathrib, which was primarily a Jewish community. About 75% of the 30,000 population at the time, the largest community in the Arabian desert, the most prosperous, was a date plantation. These Muslims stole 1/3 of the Jewish population's homes and exiled them. Oh, and that was the good part. Because the next time, rather than driving them out of town and stealing their homes, Muhammad and the first Muslims cut off the heads of every man and boy above puberty. And then after cutting off the men's heads, they raped the women. And after raping the women, they enslaved the children. They did what the Muslims did as part of Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th, 2023. They abducted, they tortured, they raped, and they committed heinous acts of mass murder, all while shouting, Allahu Akbar. It does not mean God is great. Allah is the name of the Islamic God who spends all of his time in hell. The story of Islam becomes much more interesting as we go forward, and I will share that with you in future programs. But it's important that you know what I have just shared, because it is the reason I was able to predict that everything America did, even with the world fighting on its side, would backfire, and that the blood and coin of Americans would not only be squandered in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In both places, it would make a bad situation worse. When America went into Afghanistan, a tiny part of the country was controlled by the Taliban. And the only reason the Taliban controlled any part of it is America, during the Jimmy Carter administration, with Zbigniew Brzezinski as national security advisor, came up with the lame, harebrained scheme that it would be fun to give the Russians a taste of what the Russians did to Americans in Vietnam. And so Zbigniew Brzezinski thought, why not we rent the Taliban from the Pakistani government? We'll reward the Pakistani government with the right to construct nuclear bombs, and we'll give them vast quantities of military equipment so they can shore up their dictatorship. And we will rent the Taliban from them, because the Taliban is an agency of the Pakistani government. It's like the Marines are an agency of the United States government. And we did, and we gave them all manner of weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, anti-tank missiles, and they killed lots of Russians. But once they had successfully tormented the Russians, now you had a group of Taliban, fundamentalist Muslims, armed with American weapons. So when Saddam Hussein, who was the closest ally in the West, and as bad as he was the best dictator in the Islamic world, decided to invade Kuwait en route to Saudi Arabia, which would have been a wonderful thing for the rest of the world, because it would have eliminated the fundamentalist Islamic mosques that breed terrorists the world over. But nonetheless, George Bush saw, this is my opportunity for war. And so in the aftermath of 9/11, and during the Saddam Hussein invasion, George Bush decided that he would sacrifice American blood and coin to defend Saudi Arabia. Now, mind you, America doesn't sacrifice boots on the ground and American blood to protect Israel. But we did Saudi Arabia, that fundamentalist Islamic nation that was most responsible for 9/11. And so in the process, all we ended up doing was inspiring a bigger mess, because when Saddam Hussein invaded and America was chosen to rebuff them in Saudi Arabia, the very person that and group that America hired and equipped to defeat the Russians said, if we can defeat the Russians, we can certainly defeat Saddam Hussein. And they were right. And so they pleaded with the Saudi government, the king, to drive those nasty Iraqis out of Kuwait and to keep them from invading Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabians chose American blood rather than Osama bin Laden's crew. And that's what upset him. And to the degree that he took credit for 9/11, that was his motivation. I knew all of this. I read it. You can read it. As a matter of fact, if you want to read the plans for 9/11, they didn't come from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. No, they came from the Philippines. Ramzi Youssef wrote them. His computer was confiscated by the FBI because he was caught up in a sting on another terrorist act where he tried to blow up a Trans-Pacific airline. And it was there they found the plan, more than a year in advance of it occurring, to take Muslims, have them go to American flight schools, learn to fly airplanes, hijack them, and fly them into those specific buildings. We knew it more than a year in advance. Even when Ramzi Youssef was convicted for his first attempt to blow up the World Trade Centers, when he drove a van filled with explosives into the basement and detonated it, when he was flown from the courthouse to the maximum security prison, he was able to look down. They removed the blindfold and they taunted him and say, "See, the buildings still stand." He said, "Not for long." Your government has not come clean with you in this regard. So we move forward now, and we have American troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I'm doing thousands of radio shows saying, take them out. Don't deploy them there. They're dying for nothing. They're making a bad situation worse. There is no chance you will ever defeat a religion with bullets and bombs. I actually prescribed a 3-point plan to resolve this problem. I articulated it in a book I wrote at the time called Tea with Terrorists. I've repeated it many times on these programs. I actually included it in an open letter I wrote to Israel in the immediate aftermath of 10/7 of last year. But I knew what we were doing was disastrous. I knew exactly where it was going to lead. And one of the things that I said is that by entering Iraq and by telling the Iraqis that they would have one person, one vote, and that we would install democracy as we liberated them, that Americans obviously can't count. Religious people, particularly Muslims, do as their imams tell them, because their imams tell them, if you don't do it as we tell you, we'll either kill you or Allah will take care of you and torture you in hell. And of course, there were far more Shiite Muslims than Sunni Muslims in Iraq. So when we staged that first election, guess what? It was the Shia Muslims representing Iran that prevailed. And America, with its blood and coin, gave Iraq to Iran. That is the thing that destabilized the Islamic Middle East. And when we did that, the rest of it was a lay down hand. It was certain to materialize exactly as it did. America made this great blunder of not only giving Iraq to Iran, but this is what happened next. Syria was a client of Saddam Hussein. They were both Ba'athists. But when Iraq was now in Iranian hands and Syria was deprived of oil revenues to keep up its draconian suppression of its people and to buy the necessary weapons to do so, that put the Assad regime into the hands of the the Iranian mullahs. That was our fault. We set that up. And when we set that up, it gave Iran this land bridge then to send weapons into Lebanon and to send terrorists into Lebanon, and the buildup of Hezbollah followed, with rockets launched into Israel and tunnels and all manner of threats to the very survival of Israel. And in the process, they then found a soft spot where they were able to funnel large amounts of rockets and weaponry and money and guns into the Gaza Strip, which that same president, George W. Bush, told Israel to forfeit. And look at the cost of them having done so. That put all the pieces in place, but there was yet one more to fall. That is that the United States decided on another stupid thing. We would arm fundamentalist Sunni Muslims to offset the threat of the growing Shia Muslims because we had given Iraq to Iran. Al-Sistani and his minions, and then the terrorist groups associated with the other Shiite clerics, were murdering Americans. And so we thought, we give weapons to these Sunni Muslims, well, they'll use it against the Shia. Oh, they didn't. You know where they used them? They used them to attack the minority groups in Iraq, including the Yazidi community, and of course the Kurds. And they became the Islamic State, an Islamic terrorist group manufactured by the United States, just as the United States had manufactured Al-Qaeda by supplying weapons to the Taliban to fight Russia and Afghanistan. We were now 2 for 2. And in the process of doing that, we created an incredible cancer in the midst of this Syrian desert, and so much torment for people, and rape and kidnapping and murder. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians dead, and horribly, thanks to Angela Merkel and other progressives in Europe, a virtual flood of Islamic refugees out of the killing fields, not only there, but also because of our malfeasance in Libya, where we again made the stupid decision that because Muammar Gaddafi is a bad man, it's better if we overthrow him, as opposed to recognizing that if he is overthrown, the only power left are Islamic terrorists. The same thing was true with Saddam Hussein, a bad man. But what we empowered as a result was far worse. It's a lesson we have a tough time learning. We've now seen it again in Syria. Bashar al-Assad was a horrible human being. He tortured his own people. There are no good leaders in the Islamic world. This is who they are. We can't fix them. And I can assure you that this fundamentalist Islamic coalition that is now in control of Syria will be far worse. Women will be marginalized. They will have no rights. The minorities, for example, the Kurds, the largest ethnic minority in the world without a homeland, have already been bludgeoned, and they will be attacked because the country that funded the Islamic terrorists that deposed the Assad regime were funded and armed by Turkey. And they were funded and armed by Turkey because the Turks love a good genocide. And after the Armenian genocide, they decided, we'll have a genocide of the Kurds. Erdogan is a psychopath. And it was Erdogan's decision that if he armed these jihadists to take down the Assad regime, then he could resolve the problem that was tormenting him, which was the Kurds were free and safe and independent. That couldn't last with Erdogan. He wanted a means to kill them. This was it. And so while the talking heads speak to you about elections and Western-style democracy and freedoms and human rights and protection from minorities and all of these things, I'm here to tell you none of that's going to happen. And I am certain of it. Why? Because I'm certain of Islam. It hasn't changed in 1,400 years, and it isn't going to change tomorrow. Plus, as we move forward, I'm going to tell you in our next program specifically how I came to know 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, and 1 month in advance that the Assad regime was going to fall, and when it was going to fall, and how it was going to fall, and what is going to happen next. I've shared all of this, and I will share it again. And so in our next episode of the blog, I will bring you those answers so that you are forewarned, so that you're not taken by surprise, so that you not only know the truth, but you know the one who made it possible for you to be aware of these things and protect yourself from them. I am Craig Winn. This has been the Yablog.